This lecture is going to conclude our look at Buddhist philosophy by considering the ethical implications of the metaphysical views that we saw in previous lectures. Recall that on the Buddhist view, there is no self, no permanent, self-determining thing or substance. And one might wonder whether, on such a view, anything is worth doing at all. That's because on the Buddhist view, one ought to give up all attachments and all desires. That is to say, one ought to give up wanting things to go well for oneself. And so it seems like there's no point to pursuing anything, to acting ethically especially. So there's a more general question, why bother doing anything at all? Because it seems like performing actions is supposed to somehow pertain to oneself. And likewise, there's a worry about whether one should even perform good actions, morally good actions. And so on the one hand, there's the worry of nihilism, and on the other hand, there's a worry of immoralism. We can first address the worry about nihilism, about why bother at all performing various actions, by considering an example that Mark Siderits gives to address this worry. Siderits suggests that from the Buddhist perspective, we use useful fictions. So it's a useful fiction to think about oneself as something that persists over time. So it's a useful fiction insofar as it's not an ultimate reality to have a self, but rather we conventionally treat people as having selves. And it's useful because of the Buddhist commitment to reducing suffering. So one might wonder whether you should perform an action that is going to help the self in the future if there isn't a self in the future, just some presumed self in the future. So, for example, you might wonder whether it's worth brushing your teeth. After all, if there's no self, then brushing your teeth doesn't really matter because the next person that's going to have their teeth eroded is really a different person. But Siderits suggests that it's a useful fiction here to think of oneself as being the same as the one in the future that might have their teeth get cavities or suffer other problems. And it's useful because we reduce the suffering in the future. So you reduce suffering of that potential person in the future that's going to have their teeth get cavities and so on. So that's one response to the worry about nihilism, the worry about why bother performing actions at all. But then there's the worry about why be moral. And there's several different responses that the Buddhists can offer here. Since the Buddhists believe in karma, there's one obligation to perform morally good actions coming from the fact that you'll get good karma by performing such good actions. But obviously, acting for the sake of good karma is to perpetuate the cycle of rebirth. And so the Buddhist is going to have a different, more deep explanation for why we should be moral. And that's, on the one hand, going to be to nullify or get rid of the three roots of suffering: greed, hatred, and delusion. Acting immorally by acting on the basis of greed or hatred is also going to increase the amount of suffering, and increase the amount of suffering for yourself even. And so the Buddhist is going to recommend doing morally good things that do not involve greed and hatred in order to reduce suffering, which the Buddhist presumes that you don't want to have. Now, these first two reasons so far really say that you ought to be moral because of the good results that will accrue to yourself. But the Buddhists can say that there's a deeper reason to be moral. After all, there is no self to begin with, so those first two reasons saying you ought to be moral to help yourself is a little bit misleading. And so the Buddhist is going to offer an argument that you're committed to ethical behavior if you really believe the doctrine of not self. Like the response to nihilism, This argument is drawing on Mark Siderits' understanding of Buddhism. And the argument runs as follows. First, the assumption is made that each person wishes that their own suffering be reduced or minimized, and that they wish that their future suffering be minimized and prevented. Second is the doctrine of not self, which in part holds that the self is merely conventionally real. That is to say, the self is merely to be understood in terms of a person, where a person is a bundle of psychological properties at any given time and plus over time. So if you take these two thoughts together, you get a result. If the self is merely conventionally real, if there is no permanent subsisting entity at one time and then at the next, then those two things are different. And so the future suffering that you want to minimize is really for a distinct being. In other words, there's no ultimately real distinction between one's own future suffering and others' future suffering. After all, the one in the future that you regard as yourself is really a distinct being, and so too are other people. And so your future self and other people's selves are really no different. And so if you're committed to reducing your own personal suffering, you're likewise committed to reducing others' suffering. Now, Siderits raises a good worry about this argument, namely that you do have persons that are causal series of psychological properties or qualities. And so these series are distinct, are genuinely distinct, whereas this argument suggested that you couldn't make any good distinction between other suffering and your own, whereas it seems like on the Buddhist view there is some sort of distinction, and maybe some relevant sort of distinction, such that one's personal causal series of psychological states is a different causal series than another person's psychological states. And so maybe one shouldn't accept this argument. Nevertheless, Buddhist philosophers have a lot more to say about the distinctions between ultimate and conventional reality, and likewise about the self and reducing suffering. So let us move on to think about the type of ethical theory that the Buddhist philosophy will embrace. Recall that there are three different kinds of moral or ethical theory as developed in the Western philosophical tradition. And these are often understood as mutually exclusive types of theories, that you have to embrace one or the other, and you can't embrace the others. But with Buddhist philosophy, we see that elements of each are emphasized in different places. So first of all, recall that virtue ethics focuses primarily on an individual person, on yourself, and figuring out how to perfect oneself, have a better personality or character. And the Buddhist philosophy seems to match this conception of virtue ethics insofar as there's a focus on attaining nirvana, and that's a personal sort of process. Likewise, Buddhist ethics will involve various virtues such as generosity, compassion, and so on. And so it seems like Buddhist philosophy in many ways embraces or goes down the path of virtue ethics. But there are elements of the other two theories. Recall that consequentialism holds that you ought to act such as to produce the best sorts of consequences, and specifically with utilitarianism, you want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Now that last part really agrees with the Buddhist sort of philosophy because it holds that we ought to reduce suffering. So that seems to embody the consequentialist or utilitarian view that we ought to minimize pain. But the specific way in which the Buddhist philosopher says that we ought to minimize suffering makes it lean more toward deontology. That's because some Buddhist philosophers will say that there's an absolute obligation to not cause harm, not to cause any sort of suffering. That is to say, that there is a duty to not cause suffering, and that notion of duty is what's crucial to deontology. But likewise, Buddhist ethics will emphasize the importance of intentions, which is something that deontology also focuses on. Recall that one of the things that needs to be done from a Buddhist standpoint is get rid of the 3 roots of suffering: greed, hatred, and delusion, and those really pertain to one's mental states, to one's intentions. And so the Buddhist philosopher is going to agree with the deontologist that intentions matter. So in sum, we see that Buddhist philosophy and Buddhist ethics sort of has a middle ground between the different kinds of ethical theories that we've seen so far in the course. Let's conclude by looking how this works out in practice with a specific example. This example comes from the discourse to Prince Sabaya, and that discourse concerns telling the truth, whether we should always tell the truth or whether we ought to say things that serve certain purposes. This is a concern because of 2 distinct commitments of the Buddhas. First, there's the commitment to avoid delusion, and so to get at the truth. Second, there's a commitment to reduce suffering. But there might be some situations in which those 2 commitments come in conflict, when you might need to say something false in order to reduce suffering. So it seems like the Buddha might be committed to contradictory values. Now in the discourse, the Buddha is asked whether he would utter a statement that is unwelcome, disagreeable, and unpleasant. And the question is posed in part because some truths might be unpleasant. And so the question is a loaded one. It's saying, if some truths are unpleasant to say, then you might trip yourself up, Buddha, and say something contradictory. But his response is, quote, "There is no one-sided answer," end quote. Now that might seem evasive, but what he goes on to do is distinguish 3 ways we can categorize statements or sentences. Now first, we can categorize statements as either being true or false. Second, we can distinguish statements as being beneficial or unbeneficial. And then third, we can distinguish statements as being agreeable or disagreeable. And what's really important here is the distinction between the second and third. So being agreeable or disagreeable means that you merely like it or not, or that a statement merely seems pleasing or seems displeasing. That's in contrast to the distinction between being beneficial and unbeneficial. And those pertain to whether it's genuinely, truly good for someone or genuinely not good for someone. So just because you might like to hear something doesn't mean it's actually beneficial for you. For example, you might not like to hear that you have a terminal illness, but it might be beneficial for you to hear that. So it's not agreeable, but it's beneficial. It'll help you do things that you need to do and would like to do before you die. Now, once we have these 3 distinctions in place, the Buddha goes on to clarify that what matters is truth and beneficence and not agreeableness, since agreeableness really just pertains to what is apparent to one and not what is real. And ultimately, this is because of the Buddhist commitment to the virtue of compassion. And that's why he says that we ought to state things that are true or beneficent, but agreeable or disagreeable doesn't come into the picture, because that is the true way to embody the virtue of compassion. So we see there that compassion is a virtue that the Buddha embraces, so there's an element of virtue ethics. But why are we embracing compassion? To reduce suffering, and so that seems to be somewhat consequentialist. But there's also something deontological here, namely the sort of duty to tell the truth. And so the Buddha really holds to this being something absolute. And what matters is saying the truth at the right time. So he clarifies that it's important to choose carefully when you say things. And that kind of gets at this idea that there's no one-sided answer. That circumstances are a little bit more nuanced than saying something or not saying it. So that will complete our look at Buddhist philosophy.